Hello, my friends. Today I'm going to answer this question: what is vibrational astrology? And in answering this question, I'm going to answer a related question, which is: how does vibrational astrology compare to other astrological systems? So on the left side, I've listed various astrological systems. It's not a perfect list. It's not a complete list. It's impossible to put everything into completely perfect categories, but if I don't say so myself, I think it's a pretty darn good list. And so the list is Babylonian, PreHellenisti Vedic. That's a category that I made up. That's not a common term, but I think it's an important one. Post-Hellenistic Vedic, Hellenistic, medieval and Renaissance, modern psychological, harmonic astrology as defined by John Addy, symmetrical astrology, Uranian astrology, cosmobiology as defined by Reinhold Everton, American sidereal, vibrational, Mayan, Chinese, Native American, etc. Well, on the next screen I'll explain what I mean by the etc. So those are some systems of astrology that you hear a lot about. There are a lot of variations within many of these. For example, within modern psychological, we have evolutionary astrology, humanistic astrology. I've lumped all those together under modern psychological. There are also many variations of Vedic astrology. So no categorization is going to be perfect, but I think this is an excellent start to having a survey of what the different approaches to astrology are. Now, in addition to the systems of astrology, there are other ideas that strongly influence these systems of astrology. We could call these philosophical influences, like theosophy, which has had a big impact on some forms of astrology. Also, evidence-based practice, modern physics. And some of the other influences are obvious, such as modern psychological astrology. Guess what it's strongly influenced by? Could it be modern psychology? Okay, so similarly, Vedic astrology, some people prefer to call it Jyotish, but you got the idea of what we're referring to, influenced by, or whether you want to say influenced by, has a close connection to Hindu philosophy, various kinds of Hindu philosophies. Okay, now let's answer the question. What is vibrational astrology and how is it related to all these other systems? And I think by showing the relationship, it helps make it clear what it is. Also helps clarify what the other systems are. So on the next slide is a Venn diagram. If you don't know what a Venn diagram is, no worries. It's a fancy word for something very simple, and you'll see it on the next slide. And again, none of this is perfect. Sometimes people like to argue about details, but we don't have to argue about it, but please go ahead and contribute. Post information on how you would adjust it, how you would change it. This is like version 1.0, a first draft of doing this. And maybe other people have done it, but this is my first attempt at doing it. And I haven't seen exactly this before. Okay, so I think this is an enormous step forward in clarifying some of the popular, common approaches to astrology. Are you ready? This is going to look bewildering. Warning. Here we go. Bam. Okay. What is this? Okay. What it is each of these areas, many of them are circles, but not all of them, is an approach to astrology. And we'll start in the upper left, Babylonian astrology. And we'll get to vibrational, which is one of the main topics I want to cover. And you'll see that vibrational is this light blue that spreads all the way around in this kind of, like a horseshoe kind of shape. And what the diagram is showing is that where the circles overlap, they have something in common. So Babylonian astrology is an astrology that goes back many thousands of years in the Mesopotamian Valley, and it's fairly independent. We have a pre-Hellenistic Vedic, and I've given a very tiny overlap. Now, if I showed every overlap, this would be a total mess. So this is a little bit simplified. Everybody's getting a little bit from everybody. Each system stealing a little bit, taking a little bit. But overall, Babylonian is a relatively distinct approach to astrology involving a lot of omens and things like that. At the same time Babylonian astrology was happening in the area of what is now India, Pakistan, etc. We have little bits and pieces of what that astrology was. There are, for example, the nakshatras are very, very ancient. We don't hear about them in the Babylonians, so there's something going on there in a pre-Hellenistic Vedic astrology. Okay, so heading to the right, we have post-Hellenistic astrology. So somewhere around the year 200 BC to 500 or 600 AD, there's the development of Hellenistic astrology that strongly influences Vedic astrology, and a lot of the Vedic astrology we know now is indeed strongly influenced by the Hellenistic developments. If you are a historian of astrology, you know about the work of David Pingree and that he made the strong argument about how Vedic was influenced by Hellenistic, and other people, are emphasizing, well, there was a Vedic astrology before. Anyway, there's lots of sources, Neugebauer, all these different historians. I'm not going to go into all those technical details and arguments and different perspectives. Just going to give you a general overview of what's fairly well agreed upon and my personal perspective on it. So we go Babylonian, then there's a pre-Hellenistic Vedic. We don't know a lot about it, but it was there. The post-Hellenistic Vedic, which is the kind we use now, there are variations of it, and then the Hellenistic astrology, which we have here. That'll be our 1, 2, 3rd, 4th circle. And in Hellenistic astrology is where they put together a lot of the rules that are still used today. The rulerships of the zodiac signs, all of this stuff appearing, at least from the evidence we have, really coming together in this Hellenistic period. They're drawing upon other sources, and this evolves the Hellenistic into the medieval and Renaissance. So you see a big overlap. The medieval and Renaissance astrology has a lot of overlap with Hellenistic. The use of bounds, also known as terms, and essential dignities and so on. A lot of these ideas get passed on, but not all of them. A lot of the Time Lord systems used in Hellenistic astrology do not continue very strongly into the medieval and Renaissance period. The Time Lord systems in Hellenistic have a lot in common with the dashas used in Vedic. So that's why there's some overlap there. So we come into the medieval and Renaissance, another big movement in astrology. And then much later, astrology gets revived around the middle of the 1800s and eventually develops into modern psychological astrology, this circle. So it has some overlap with medieval and Renaissance. It's inherited the ruling signs of the planets and lots of other rules, but a whole new framework is developed built on ideas in psychology and the idea that astrology functions in a primarily psychological and personal, humanistic, Rudyard would call it person-centered, and you get these ideas of personal evolution with evolutionary astrology. All of this develops, and the modern psychological is also influenced philosophically by theosophy. So Mark Edmund Jones, Dane Rudyard, a lot of the early astrologers who built this transition to modern psychological, like Dane Rudyard, they were very involved in theosophy. So there's a transition there. So I thought it would be nice to include a little circle of theosophy's impact. So you have the modern psychological movement, and you also notice the disagreements. A lot of people say, well, the Vedic is more factual, more tangible. Same thing with medieval and Renaissance. This movement into the psychological, a lot of people feel like it's too flaky. A lot of people feel like it's more realistic. So you have these developments, these movements. You cannot put life into perfect little boxes. But I think this Venn diagram does a fairly good job, as good as we can do, in showing how these things develop and evolve. And then out of modern psychological, other things start to happen. More numerically based approaches, more technically based approaches that incorporate some scientific ideas, such as the harmonic astrology of John Addy. So I've got this circle here overlapping with the modern psychological. We also have the development of symmetrical astrology, emphasis on what are called planetary pictures and midpoint structures and things like this. That develops. It's got actually very little overlap with the modern psychological, because in modern psychological, they're not using these symmetrical patterns. And then within this circle, this pink circle of symmetrical, I've got a circle within it of Uranian. Uranian is a specific kind of symmetrical astrology where they use these trans-Neptunian planets, as they call them. They go under various names. They're not the same as the trans-Neptunian objects that are real things known, identified by astronomers in the Kuiper Belt, but they have some interesting ideas in Uranian astrology. It's fundamentally a brand of symmetrical, probably the most popular brand. And then there was another movement, this circle here, of cosmobiology, as defined by Reinhold Eberton. And it uses a lot of these symmetrical ideas. It takes a lot of the ideas, the midpoint structures, makes it very grounded, removes many of the ideas, so it has a lot of overlap. It's a kind of a simplified and distilled version, just taking some major concepts, and you have the cosmobiology. So you see these overlapping developments in astrology. Now, I've got the big blue vibrational astrology, and that's the one that I want to talk about primarily. Vibrational astrology takes from many different sources. We have found that there are close connections between the PreHellenisti Vedic and the vibrational. They're actually connected. This was not a conscious decision, but it appears that the lineage of ideas developed in vibrational go all the way back to this PreHellenisti Vedic. I've made videos about this. The direct sources and influences for developing vibrational astrology are John Addey's harmonic. We're taking almost half of that overlap, quite a bit from harmonic astrology, taking quite a lot, almost half, from modern psychological. Of course, these, whether it's half or a fourth or a third, who knows? I'm just trying to give a general impression of what feels approximately correct. Vibrational astrology builds on a lot of the modern psychological ideas. The ideas on zodiac signs taken directly from Dane Rudger. Some of the ideas on houses used in vibrational astrology also taken directly from Dane Rudger. A lot of the ideas of the chart as an evolving map for what you are designed to do, like a spiritual roadmap. All these ideas taken from modern psychological. A lot of pre-Hellenistic Vedic and harmonic. And the big part of vibrational astrology is influenced not so much by other systems of astrology, but by the philosophy, this framework of evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice has become the big mantra, the big thing that's driving what's going on in psychology, what's going on in medicine. So many fields are now aligned with this whole philosophy and theory of evidence-based practice. It's very specific. There are very specific rules. There are ways that you define levels of evidence. And instead of developing the ideas based on personal opinion and experience and preference, you have criteria, clear criteria for developing levels of confidence. So vibrational astrology is part of the evidence-based practice movement. And you'll notice there's very little of other astrology, forms of astrology, overlap as much with the evidence-based practice. The evidence-based practice is this huge a pink area. It's just this area here, this thin thing going around here, thin here, and all the way up into here. So this thing, and it overlaps primarily with vibrational. Now, John Addey's harmonics, and also symmetrical astrology and cosmobiology, they existed before the evidence-based practice movement began. The evidence-based practice movement began around the mid-1980s, started really growing around the 1990s. So saying there's an overlap here, you could argue, well, there can't be an overlap because how could harmonic astrology be drawing on evidence-based practice when evidence-based practice really didn't even exist at that time? But I think that the heart of the idea, the spirit of it, the idea of checking more carefully, that wasn't born in the 1980s. It became crystallized and clarified and clear rules and a huge requirement to base practices on evidence, solid evidence, and the criteria for evidence. So in spirit, in concept, there's the John Addy's harmonics. He did a lot of research, a lot of looking at databases. It was in that spirit of evidence-based practice. Also symmetrical astrology, cosmobiology, also in that frame of reference of emphasizing that. Modern psychological, not as much, but a little bit. So what is vibrational astrology? If you look at this Venn diagram, number one, it's an evidence-based practice. And that distinguishes it very strongly from other systems which have little bits of evidence-based practice. And again, this is very well defined. It's very clear. I've made dozens of videos about what an evidence-based practice is. We have very strict criteria with our research groups. It's a real, strict, well-developed, sophisticated philosophy of how to develop confidence in ideas. So vibrational astrology is very strongly evidence-based. That distinguishes from other things. It's got some ideas from harmonics, got some ideas from modern psychological, has quite a bit from cosmobiology. Maybe this should even take a little bit more of this circle of cosmobiology into the vibrational. And here's another unique thing about vibrational astrology. Number one unique thing is it's so heavily based on an evidence-based practice. Number two, it's taken ideas from modern physics, a lot of ideas, not just in vague general ways, but very specifically on the nature of spin, also known as angular momentum, how angular momentum, dimension reduction, all kinds of very specific, you might say technical ideas in physics, that they are part of astrology. So we see vibrational astrology taking ideas from modern physics, taking ideas from cosmobiology, taking ideas from symmetrical astrology, ideas from modern psychological, ideas from John Addy, and it becomes its own integrated system. It is not a hodgepodge. It's not like, we throw this in, throw this in. It's a very clear, well-defined, everything fits together. It's like a beautiful tapestry, a beautiful puzzle. And you can see how elements of this system, very tightly integrated, clear system, draw upon other elements and integrate, absorb it into it. It's like it digests it into its system. It's not like thrown together like a hodgepodge. So these are the lot of influences, and this is why it's so difficult to describe what a system of astrology is. What is medieval and Renaissance? It's picking up from other ideas, passing those ideas onto other systems that pick them up. This, I think, is a fairly realistic image of what is going on. And when someone asks, what is vibrational astrology? It's hard to answer in 25 words or less. Although I could say it's an evidence-based system that draws upon ideas in harmonics, modern psychological, PreHellenistic Vedic, symmetrical, and cosmobiology, and modern physics. Well, maybe I just did it in 25 words or less. So that's what it is. And the first thing I would say is an evidence-based practice that has ideas built from these various sources. So that's where we have it. And if we look at a few of the other things, here's American sidereal, which, like harmonic astrology and cosmobiology, intersects with an evidence-based approach, a little more emphasis on verifying, confirming. One of the things the American siderealists do is they look at the astronomy very carefully. What are we actually talking about? This kind of detailed, factual orientation is strong. And it overlaps with Vedic astrology insofar as it uses the sidereal zodiac. So I put a little overlap there. It's got a connection. It was rooted in some study of Egyptian hieroglyphics and what they were meaning. So maybe I should put a little Egyptian thing here. I didn't do that, but this is not, we can edit, we can develop, but it's pretty accurate, and I think it gives you a good sense. And then there are other systems, Chinese, Native American, Mayan. They're relatively independent. Nothing's 100% independent. This is simplified. Otherwise, we have a tangle. And, there are going to be subtle connections and little things connecting almost all of these different systems. But for the most part, they're fairly separate. And under Native American, I put etc. Lots of indigenous astrological systems. We say Chinese, but, what kind of astrology was practiced in Southeast Asia and so on. Some form of astrology seems to be practiced everywhere. So, and those in turn can be influenced all the way back to Babylonian or possibly pre-Hellenistic Vedic. There's a lot of things we don't know, and there's certainly strands of connections that are complex between all of this. But for the most part, if we were to say 90% and leave out 10% of more subtle things, this stands fairly well. So there you have it, my friends. What is vibrational astrology? It's an evidence-based practice. That's numero uno. That's the big one. And that's a very specific, detailed subject that I explain in more detail. And it's an evidence-based practice that's drawn upon ideas from harmonic astrology, modern psychological astrology, pre-Hellenistic Vedic astrology, modern physics, symmetrical astrology, cosmobiology. It's got a lot of different threads that it's pulled together into a whole new system. All right, that's what vibrational astrology is. I hope you find this helpful, because a lot of times people are getting into astrology and it gets confusing, and if you're studying medieval and Renaissance and then you jump over to modern psychological, you've entered a new world. So a few things look familiar, most of it looks very different. Or look at it, if you're doing medieval and Renaissance or modern, I've got no overlap between modern psychological and Vedic astrology. There's some overlap. There's always some overlap with it. But realistically, extremely little. And you get confused, like, whoa, what are they talking about? I'm in a new world. Yeah, you're in a new world. And so some worlds overlap with others. And in vibrational, everybody finds something familiar because you'll see some parts of it, but most of it's unfamiliar. And especially the whole concepts, especially, and the ideas taken from physics. Oh my God, they're like really very, very new. What the planets even do, that they're not archetypes, they're energy forces. A whole different way of thinking. Okay, so it's good to have this perspective on what's going on in the relationship of these different systems. Please go ahead and comment and add little corrections and edits and new ideas. This is the first attempt to do this. Again, I'm happy with it, but there are going to be improvements. Thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.